The air tasted of dust and cold fear, a constant metallic tang that had replaced the familiar smell of exhaust and manufactured comfort 2 years ago. Elias pulled his frayed wool shawl tighter against the biting chill. There was no heat flowing into homes across the fractured landscape, just as there were no steady lights, and often the promise of fresh water was a lie. The great nation, the United States, was gone, extinguished not by the terrifying flash of nuclear fire or the roar of traditional armies, but by silence. The silence that fell when the entire country went dark, plunged into chaos by an attack they had been arrogant enough to believe they were ready for. Elias paused atop a ridge, looking down into a valley where a few struggling pinpricks of fire marked a settlement. These were the new territories, small islands of organization carved out of the ruins, where the population sought refuge and the possibility of survival. The land had reverted to a brutal simplicity, a time where law and order was nothing more than the cold calculus of survival of the fittest. The thought of finding a safe place brought with it immediate danger. Most of these new, independent towns were fiercely protective of their own citizens and viewed strangers with profound suspicion, often refusing entry. Survival had bred paranoia. Being alone meant living in constant, gnawing fear, knowing that the isolated rarely survived. He needed strength in numbers, but this was not something he could have, because he was once a soldier. And soldiers were not only unwelcomed, but in some territories hated, hunted, and executed if captured. Elias often found himself imagining the swiftness of the collapse. The history books, the few fragile, printed pages that remained, would one day struggle to explain how overconfidence had been the undoing of a superpower. The president and the government had managed to alienate every single ally, forcing the nation to stand alone just before the unseen enemy struck. And then came the betrayal. Someone within had turned, ensuring that before any preventative measures could be deployed, the final, lethal blow was delivered. The stock markets collapsed, currency was worthless as banks and businesses crumbled, ending capitalism as they knew it, and ensuring the massive depletion of the natural resource reserves. The lights had flickered out, and with them, the promises of the modern world. As he rested behind the cover of a large boulder with a rifle resting against his chest, his stomach cramped, reminding him of the new, harsh reality. Without currency, trading and obtaining goods and services had reverted entirely to bartering. When tangible goods were exhausted, people were forced to barter the only asset remaining, themselves. They offered their labor, working on small farms or within the confines of small towns, diligently serving the leaders of those towns, some of whom were corrupt, ruthless, and deadly. All of this servitude, all this degradation was endured by workers, simply in an effort to protect and save families. Elias once had a family, but to protect them, he had to go into hiding, and to everyone who knew him, he was dead. Well, almost everyone. After his return, he stayed clear of his family. He had but one friend he trusted, and that friend explained how the new world worked. He sent Elias on a journey where he would be safe and could try and rebuild a life for himself. His journey took him from the far north, near the Canadian border, down through what was once the state of Idaho, before settling on an Indian reservation in Wyoming. Along the way, he encountered similar settlements like the one he was watching from the hilltop. But unlike this one, many of these sparsely populated communities were minimally fortified, and scattered throughout them were the charred remains of small shelters and bodies after strong nearby militia forces overpowered them, taking with them supplies and equipment, and in some cases, women survivors and men who chose surrender instead of death. To survive, Elias became a lone scavenger of sorts, venturing out and exploring these nearby settlements, breaking down tents and other small man-made structures that had been abandoned or had been damaged by more powerful forces. He would bury the dead before removing any evidence a settlement existed, taking with him any supplies and equipment he could use. He heard whispers, dark rumors carried on the wind, about certain towns that did, strangely, welcome strangers. These were not havens of refuge. They were instead places of the lowest form of depravity and corruption. They existed on the periphery, fueled by the desperation of a broken populace. Men traveled to these places frequently, either to gamble or to enjoy the company of a temporary companion. They paid not in gold or dollars, but in ration credits they had painstakingly earned working in other, more rigid settlements. The world was such a different place now, and Elias had to put his moral and ethical compass away, burying it deep to avoid getting involved and drawing attention to himself. Elias knew the risk. To enter a welcoming town was to risk succumbing to the moral decay that defined the era, but sometimes desperation outweighed honor. He made his descent into the valley, deliberately avoiding the main, well-guarded road leading to the protective settlement of New Haven. Instead, he tracked the faint path of worn tires and footprints. He was heading for a small settlement 10 miles east of New Haven. Rumors spread that the settlement had been overtaken by the New Haven forces. As he walked, his mind returned, as it often did, to the accusations that had shattered the vestiges of the established order years prior. The remaining fragments of the federal government and the U.S. military had been brutally targeted. They were hunted, jailed, and in far too many cases, summarily executed. The charges had been devastating: that the government had secretly entered an agreement with the victorious enemy, promising to eradicate certain portions of the population in exchange for a continued flow of natural resources. Elias remembered the fury, the speed with which the mobs had acted. The sources of the allegations were unknown, but the frenzy was absolute. Though those allegations would eventually be proven false, the damage inflicted was irreversible. The country was ruined, and trust in centralized authority was zero. Those who had served were now pariahs, forced to live in hiding or perish under the weight of mob justice. He reached the outskirts of the settlement just as the perpetual gray dusk deepened. Unlike the careful fortifications of New Haven, the settlement was sloppy, defined by ramshackle buildings cobbled together from salvaged metal and rotting wood. As he walked through the settlement with his rifle at the ready, the scent of smoke and death was overwhelming. He began gathering tarps, blankets, and broke down some of the small structures that were damaged in the pitiful fight. He went back to his horse and pulled a shovel and dug several shallow graves for the few bodies that were left for dead. After covering their bodies, he took one more look around, gathering food, medicine, and ammunition, and just as important, batteries which provided limited electric power for heat and communications. Before the sun rose across the valley, Elias climbed up on his horse and headed into the foggy forest. He traveled through the moist air, staying clear of New Haven and roving militia patrols until he finally arrived at his destination. A weathered farmhouse riddled with bullet holes and scarring from skirmishes that blew out windows and left gaping holes in portions of the roof. He climbed off the horse and walked around to the back of the house, where he removed the supplies and the saddle and allowed the horse to rest and graze in the nearby field. He walked up on the porch and disappeared into the house. Across the field, 3 men were watching from a distance. Looking for shelter and supplies, armed with an old revolver, they slowly moved in with the hope of overpowering Elias and claiming the house and its contents for themselves. They made their way to the front door and tried in vain to remain silent as they walked along the wood porch. They carefully pushed open the cracked front door that was not locked and entered with one man leading the way, pointing the revolver forward. They managed to make it inside without a struggle and looked around the house, but Elias was nowhere to be found. They looked through the broken windows that looked out onto the perimeter of the house, but all they could see was wet, empty fields and mud from the thick fog that had blanketed the landscape. The men remained vigilant for hours, thinking Elias would return, but he never showed himself. Eventually, exhaustion, cold, and hunger took their toll on the 3 men, and after they started a fire in the fireplace, they fell asleep. The next morning, Elias was out in the nearby stable, clearing the mud from the hooves of his horse before giving him a good brushing. A few yards away, near the edge of a wooden fence that separated the house from the enormous grass fields, were 3 new piles of moist dirt.